for serious readers.
Jason Brennan, you teach philosophy at Georgetown University. Has the election of Donald Trump made your academic colleagues more sympathetic to your case against democracy?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's made them more sympathetic, and in general, it's made the public more sympathetic. So my best evidence for this was doing an NPR interview a couple of years ago, and people were calling in and were quite against a lot of the stuff they had to say, and I did it again a year ago, and people called in and were saying the opposite, like, I know, what do we do about this? So it's not that people are sympathetic to the point of saying, like, I might be right, but rather sympathetic to the point of saying, clearly there's a problem and it's time to think seriously about solutions.
Of course, some of us would have thought if Hillary Clinton had gotten elected, that might also have been an argument against democracy.
That's right. And in a sense, like, none of the things that I'm saying, I didn't predict that Trump was going to win. I wasn't writing this in anticipation of a Trump victory. And in a sense, my worries about democracy are systematic. They don't depend upon Brexit. They don't depend upon a Trump victory. But it is true that given how my colleagues tend to think, and they're generally speaking left-leaning, that when someone like Trump comes to power, they worry more than when someone who's closer to their side comes to power.
And of course, libertarians have been saying since the election, we told you not to give the president so much power.
Yeah, absolutely. Most people say that they care about procedural constraints, they care about checks and balances, and I think they believe that when they're in opposition. Then they suddenly start worrying about procedure. When they're in power, they want to get things done, and anything that gets in their way just seems like an unnecessary, antiquated roadblock. So of course that's how they reason. People are not very principled about their commitment, I think, to checks and balances.
Well, that's certainly true a lot of times. I heard David Axelrod on the Diane Rehm show saying, yeah, the filibuster will be a way of constraining, and Senator McConnell is an institutionalist who probably won't change the filibuster. He sounded much more sympathetic to the filibuster as a way of limiting a president's power than I think he would have been 8 years ago.
Yeah, that seems absolutely right, yeah.
So the basic thesis of your book is that most voters just aren't smart enough or informed enough to cast a sensible vote.
Yeah, that's right. And in a sense, like, we've been doing studies of voter behavior and voter knowledge for over 65 years now, and what's interesting is like how little they know has remained constant. 65 years ago, people knew hardly anything. Now they know hardly anything. Even though we have smartphones that contain all the world's information at our fingertips, we use them to look at pictures of cats and argue about meaningless things. Voters hardly know anything. And Philip Converse, the great political scientist, had a nice quote about this where he said, the two simplest facts I know about voter knowledge are that the mean is low and variance is high. So if you were to take sort of the American electorate and give them a quiz of just basic facts, the most basic questions that would be relevant to an election, which is done every 2 years by something called the American National Election Studies, what you find is that really the top 25% of voters, they get sort of like a B+ on this quiz. The next kind of middle 50%, they do roughly about the same as chance, and the bottom 25% actually do worse than chance. We give them a multiple choice test, and they get more than 75% of the questions wrong. And that's the electorate, the people who actually vote. When we try testing the people who stay home, they know even less. And none of this would really matter if political information didn't change how we vote, but as I argue in the book, it does in fact change how we vote.
So political information is a good thing generally, because after all, you would want your plumber to know plumbing and you want your doctor to know medicine. And since voters are choosing the rules that will govern me, I guess I'd like them to know what the effects of that are. So why does it matter whether the voters are well informed?
Yeah, well, let's use an analogy to, say, medicine. Suppose I have stomach pains. Well, knowing that I have stomach pains maybe tells me enough to know that I want the stomach pains to go away, but it doesn't magically imbue me with the knowledge to know that it's stomach cancer. I have to go see an expert to find that out. And even if I learn that I have stomach cancer, that doesn't magically imbue me with the knowledge to learn how to get rid of stomach cancer. I need to know something about how to treat it, and that requires a certain degree of expertise. I think that's true also of political problems. So you might look around your hometown and maybe you're vaguely aware that people are unemployed and things used to be better. And even knowing those basic facts really goes beyond what many voters know. They don't really know unemployment statistics. They don't really know the trajectory of the economy. They don't really know whether things are getting better and worse. But even if they know that, they might be able to acquire what you might call reasonable outcome preferences, meaning they know where they want the country to go. And maybe they're reasonable in assessing those things. But then to figure out what you want, what policies you want to implement, and which leaders you want to advocate to get rid of the problems, requires some degree of knowledge. You need to know which policies are going to work. So if I look around and say, oh, there's a lot of crime, and one candidate says, great, I'm going to increase the drug war, I'm going to have stop and frisk policies, I'm going to do a number of other things, and another candidate says, I'm going to reduce licensing requirements and end the drug war and have a different kind of policing system. You knowing that you want crime to be reduced doesn't tell you enough to pick between those two candidates. You have to know something about social science, something about which of these policies is likely to work better. So I think to be a good voter requires knowledge of basic facts, what's actually happening. And when we survey voters, we find that they mostly don't know that. It requires knowledge of what candidates are likely to do if they win power. We survey voters, they generally don't know that. And then it requires knowledge of social science to know what's the economics of this, what's going to happen if they actually get their way, and they don't know that.
Of course, just knowing a lot of things doesn't necessarily give you the answer. You and Paul Krugman disagree on a lot, even though you're both very well educated. Mm-hmm. And you and Robbie George, the conservative professor at Princeton, disagree on a lot, even though you're both very well educated.
Yeah, that's right. So it's not that simply having access to the facts will necessarily lead to agreement. Nevertheless, we can test to see if knowledge does make a difference in people's behavior. So there's a very nice book by a political scientist named Scott Althaus, published in 2003, called Collective Preferences in Democratic Politics. And in that book, he looks at data from the American National Election Studies, and he asks the question, how do people's demographics affect their voting behavior? The fact that you're one particular race, or you're high income or low income, or that you're employed and unemployed. And he also looks at the effect of information while controlling for that. So if you give people a quiz and you ask them who they are, what they know, and what they want, and you do this with thousands of people, you can then determine how information affects what people want while controlling for whatever effect who they are has on their preferences. And what he finds, and this is a surprising result, it's not guaranteed by the method, is that in general, as people become better informed, regardless of their background party, regardless of their background demographics, they tend to move towards one set of policies, and when they become uninformed, they tend to move towards a different set of policies. And then we can look at the median voter in the U.S. and find that they tend to act as if they're an uninformed voter. Interestingly, other people like Brian Kaplan and Martin Gillens and a few others have done similar kinds of tests using different data sets, and they get the same results. So I think we can say things like, yeah, Paul Krugman and I will end up disagreeing on a lot of things, but in general, high information voters are more in favor of immigration than the average voter. They're more in favor of free trade than the average voter. They're in favor of criminal justice reform. They're actually in favor of increasing taxes to offset the deficit rather than, say, reducing taxes. The policies they advocate don't really go to a Democratic direction. They don't really go in a Republican direction. They don't quite go in a libertarian direction. They're nuanced.
Nuanced, although it does seem like they tend in the libertarian direction. Since I'm a libertarian, I wrote a book on libertarianism. Mm-hmm. I tend to think if you understand the world better, you'd be more libertarian. Yeah. So that sort of seems to confirm my priors.
That's true. I mean, they are, in general, the informed, enlightened electorate is more economically and civil libertarian than the uninformed actual public that we have. That's not to say that they go all the way to libertarianism. If anything, they might be more sort of nuanced, pro-welfare state people who advocate a significant degree of economic and personal liberty, but they're not going to, say, dismantle the welfare state the way that many libertarians would want to do.
Which, to some extent, is sort of the consensus of where the country is. We have a welfare state, but we understand that it's very expensive. Mm-hmm. We do have more or less free trade. We have been moving in the direction of admitting more people to political and social society, gay people, Jews, black people, women, immigrants. All those kinds of things are kind of the consensus, but maybe it's the consensus of informed voters, mm-hmm. which therefore influences the way things actually happen.
Yeah, so one reason to think that maybe uninformed voting isn't as dangerous as we might think has to do with work being done by people like Benjamin Page and Martin Gillens, where they're looking at, so Martin Gillens wrote a really good book called Affluence and Influence, and in that book he asks, when people in the public disagree about what policies to implement, say people the 10th percentile of income, the 50th percentile of income, and the 90th percentile of income, what do presidents do? With whom do they side? And in general, he finds that presidents tend to side with the people the 90th percentile of income. In fact, Johnson and Kennedy and Obama are unusually likely to do that, and then George W. Bush, who many of my colleagues would call a plutocrat, was actually much more likely to side with the 10th percentile of income than other presidents were. And so Gillens, when he writes this, he's a little bit horrified because he's a small d Democrat and wants democracy to work, and he thinks that the median voter should have a lot of influence. the other hand, he notes that high-income voters are also tend to be high-information voters, low-income voters tend to be low-information voters, and they tend to favor completely different sets of policies. So the high-income voters tend to be, and high-information voters as well, tend to be pro-free trade, pro-gay rights, not very pugilistic, they were against the Iraq War. The low-information voters tend to have the opposite preferences. And so Gillen says, well, substantively, it looks like part of what might be happening here is that the high-information voters are carrying more weight than the low-information voters. Politicians can, to some degree, get away with doing things that the median voter doesn't want. So I read something like that, and my friend Brian Kaplan has a similar reaction. We think maybe this is explaining why democracy overperforms. There is a tendency for democracy to do what the average person in the public wants, but there's also significant independence among the bureaucracies, among politicians, and they often do produce policies that are better than what we would expect if the public just got what it wanted.
You describe three kinds of citizens whom you call hobbits, hooligans, and Vulcans. What do you mean by that?
Sure. So these are meant to be sort of ideal types to kind of like make it easier to think about how people think and how they react. So if you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings movies, hobbits, or if you read the books, even better, hobbits don't really care much about the outside world. They're not interested in adventure. They just want to sort of live their lives, have breakfast, their second breakfast, their 11sies and lunch, smoke their pipes and be on with it. And the political equivalent of that would be a citizen who doesn't have a firm or fixed ideology, doesn't have very many political opinions, doesn't pay much attention to politics, and as a result doesn't know much about politics, and doesn't really participate much. They just want to sort of lead their lives. And the average, say, non-voter in the U.S. is a hobbit, so described. If you've ever been to, say, a soccer game in another country where people actually care about soccer, I've been to soccer games in Brazil, and I've seen what it's like. You know that there are these sports fans who are just really rabid about sports. And when we look at how sports fans act, they tend to consume a lot of information. They know a lot about the teams. They can tell you about plays that took place 40 years ago in some game. They know stats off the top of their head. So they're very well informed, but they're also extremely biased. So take, say, Tom Brady and Deflategate. If you ask people in New England, is he guilty? They say, of course not. If you ask people in the rest of the country, they say he was guilty. I'm from New England, so of course I think he wasn't guilty. And that's the case where you're getting the same bit of information, but you're processing that information in a very biased way that just confirms your priors and makes your side look good. So you have these are high information, biased people. And the political analog would be a person who knows a lot about politics, but only consumes information that confirms their priors. They ignore, evade, or reject information that just confirms it. They see members of the other political teams as rivals, whom they regard as stupid and evil. They participate a great deal, but they don't process information in a rational way. And frankly, that's kind of the other half of the American public. Vulcans I use sort of as an ideal type, where a Vulcan is supposed to be a dispassionate, rational person who doesn't have loyalty to his or her beliefs and is willing to give them up when new evidence comes in. And the reason I bring them up is not because I think there are a lot of Vulcans. It's not because I advocate the rule of the Vulcans, because I don't really think there are any. Rather, it's because I think other democratic theorists, when they're thinking about how democracy is supposed to go, what they have in mind is how it would work with Vulcans, when in fact what we have are hobbits and hooligans. So my next question was going to be, but are there any Vulcans? It sounds like there aren't. Well, some people are more Vulcanish than others. Some people, I think, try to do things that make them better behaved when it comes to politics. They frequently read things on the other side. They frequently try to get in the heads of people with whom they disagree. So there might be, I think some people come closer to that ideal than others. Like I'd say, just to name a name, like Jeff Brennan, not a relative of mine, but I think he's very Vulcan-like. But is anyone a pure Vulcan? Probably not. And the scary thing about this too, so one sort of test of whether you're a Vulcan is, can you explain other people's worldview in a way that they find amenable? Like, so which our friend Brian Kaplan calls the ideological Turing test. Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so the Turing test, for those who haven't heard of this, is supposed to be a thing where computers simulate being human, and if you can't tell the difference between communicating with the computer and communicating with a human, then it's supposed to be evidence that the computer is actually intelligent. So an ideological Turing test would be like that. Are you able to articulate and defend a position that's not yours in a way that people who advocate that position accept? They find amenable. They think that's a good description of what I believe. So Diana Mutz, who's a political scientist at Penn, wrote a really good book called Hearing the Other Side that investigates this kind of question, along with a few other questions. And here's something that she finds. If I ask you, okay, you're a Democrat, why would anyone be a Republican? And your answer is, oh, because they're stupid and they're evil. That predicts you participate heavily in politics, you give money to politics, you're involved in 3 or more causes, and you vote frequently, early, and often. If, on the other hand, you say, well, I'm a Democrat, but let me explain why smart Republicans would say what they say, and you can actually articulate their worldview, that predicts you don't really participate, you don't give money to causes, you kind of stay home. So it looks like what we have are the high information people tend to be sort of extremist true believers, and then we have a massive hobbits who just sort of vacillate back and forth between different views and aren't very fixed. And the kind of ideal democratic citizen that, the dispassionate social scientist who's trying to reach compromise and figure things out is largely a myth, and insofar as we do have people like that, they're just not that into politics. They just don't participate that much.
Now, the message of Star Trek was that you don't want the Vulcans making the decisions. You want them advising a decision maker who brings more than pure rationality into the decision.
Yeah, I have to say, maybe gut reactions are really good when you're fighting Klingons in interstellar space. I'm not so sure about that when it comes to, say, choosing monetary policy or trade policy. I think in this case we can look at people's guts and ask how well do the guts tend to do, and I don't think they do very well. I tend to agree with someone like Brian Kaplan and think, I use economic issues a lot because it's the thing I know the most about, and it's not that when we think about, say, trade policy and so on, it's not that the public understands the economist's point of view and rejects it because they find fault with it. It's that they don't even understand why economists would be in favor of trade in the first place. The complaints that they have, it's not that they've studied it and said, well, trade leaves these people behind and hurts them. They haven't studied that in depth. They don't really know what the stats are. They don't know how to test that. I think we're just biased to think of the world, say, in zero-sum terms. And I think maybe, if I had to speculate, I'm guessing it's because of our evolutionary past. We spent so much of our history living in small family clans of 120 members or less, and we are not, in a sense, built cognitively for living in a large market economy. I think people don't understand that. I think they're inherently antipathic to foreigners, to people that are different from them. They don't trust them. They see interacting with them as dangerous. And that kind of mentality might have made sense if you're a small hunter-gatherer tribe 60,000 years ago. It doesn't make sense for our current world. I think we can't really trust our guts and our emotions. I think we have to trust our heads more.
Isn't it pretty unusual for a philosophy professor to know anything about economics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly the case. Maybe it's part of the strange graduate program I came from. So for what it's worth, in something called the Philosophical Gourmet, the University of Arizona is #1 ranked in political philosophy, so they do very well. But they're also weird in that it's very common there for people to concentrate not just in political philosophy in itself, but rather the intersection of politics, philosophy, and economics. There's a kind of methodology there that holds that before you go philosophizing about institutions and asking what makes them just or unjust, you should know how they work. And and that seems like an obviously true thing to say, like why would anyone disagree? But it's not how everyone thinks. Many philosophers say, well, what I'm doing is ideal theory. I'm just trying to figure out what perfectly just institutions would look like if only people were angels. And for that reason, I don't really need to know much about how institutions work. What I, as a philosopher, do is basically come up with what you might call a moral utility curve, a ranking of all possible states of affairs from better to worse, and then I hand it over to the social scientists, and they tell me how far up we can get on that. But in my own academic experience, I have to teach mixed classes, so I spend, the class I'm going to teach tomorrow afternoon will be one where we spend a good half of the semester just looking at social science.
Well, that's probably useful. Probably the most famous thing William F. Buckley Jr., the founder of the modern conservative movement, ever said was, I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston telephone directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University. Maybe I should ask first, if you are sufficiently Vulcan-like, to understand why he would say that, but then you think he's wrong.
Yeah, so I think one of the worries people have if you talk about alternatives to democracy is that, well, what if the elites are sort of beguiled by bad ideas? And then for that reason we might think, well, maybe there's a lack of common sense, maybe they're not going to know what they're talking about, maybe they'll be mistaken about certain things, and the average person will actually know better. And he might be right about that. I would say I'd rather be governed by the Harvard economics department than by the first 2,000 people in the Boston phone book. But if I had to take the entire Harvard faculty over the first 2,000 people in the Boston phone book, maybe I'd go the other way. I'm not sure.
Because that sounds like you just gave away the argument of your book. I mean, you're arguing for something you call epistocracy. Mm-hmm. which you did not invent the word,
No.
but it's a new enough word that it's not in my dictionary and not in Wikipedia.
Right.
But it means rule of those who know.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like you'd be on the opposite side from Buckley.
Right. So I think what Buckley is getting right is that if you concentrate it in the hands of a very small number of extremely educated people, there's a potential for real distortions to take place there, where maybe people believe just bad ideas and they reinforce these bad ideas among each other. So that's why I might be worried about, say, the Harvard faculty as a whole. I think there are certain departments, I won't name them, but there are certain departments at Harvard that, and in many universities, where they just, all they do is propagate bad ideas and reinforce them. They don't do very intellectually serious work. Their work doesn't, say, meet the methodological standards of political science, and they just kind of pontificate to one another back and forth. So I think he's right about that. But my worry is something like this. When you have, democracy has bad incentives. Political knowledge is quite low on average, perhaps even lower than ignorance. They're actually maybe not just simply ignorant, but misinformed. And when you spread out power very widely, what you're going to have is an overwhelming number of misinformed voices. If you concentrate it in the hands of the very, very few and people at the very top, then you might have different kinds of distortions. So I think what you want is something in between, a system in which political power is spread out widely. You're getting diverse points of view coming in, not simply people with PhDs, but other kinds of people that have other kinds of information, but not necessarily giving complete and equal voice to everyone in the country, regardless of what they know.
And maybe it's my mistake to have posed it that way, because the Harvard faculty obviously is people who are very high on cognitive skills, also very well educated. They all have PhDs. They teach as a profession. But there are, of course, many very smart people and even more smart people and well-informed people who are not academics. Mm-hmm. So you do not argue in the book that academics should rule. You argue that well-informed people should have more of a role in choosing our leaders and therefore our policies.
That's right. And for what it's worth, I mean, when you look at even surveys of basic political knowledge, simply having a bachelor's degree as opposed to a high school diploma only predicts you do a little bit better on these tests. Even getting a master's degree only predicts you do a little bit better. I mean, the main thing that predicts whether you know something is actually if you find it interesting. Right, so an epistocratic system, so if you think of democracy as the power of the people, everyone gets, say, an equal voice. A democracy is supposed to be a system in which all citizens have fundamentally equal political power. No actual country is a democracy so described. We exclude 16-year-olds on the basis of the grounds that they're supposed to be ignorant. We exclude felons. We include people who aren't even living here anymore. They can still vote. But anyways, if that's what democracy is supposed to be, epistocracy, which is a term coined by the philosopher David Estlin, though he doesn't himself advocate it, is any kind of political system in which political power is by law apportioned in some way according to knowledge. So there are many different ways of implementing this. The one that everyone likes to point to is Plato's philosopher kings. No one advocates that. Plato probably didn't even advocate that. It was probably just a thought experiment. But other kinds of systems that are maybe more plausible are things like plural voting. So John Stuart Mill, back in the 1860s, advocated representative government, and he wanted to give everybody at least one vote, but he thought that perhaps people who had more knowledge, more credentials should get an extra vote in order to make sure that ignorant and misinformed voters don't always carry the day. You could have a system in which, by default, you don't get the right to vote, but if you can pass a very basic quiz of political knowledge, you can identify who the candidates are and which party controls Congress and maybe 2 or 3 facts about things that have happened recently, then you get the right to vote. Otherwise, you don't. You could have a system, something advocated by the Mexican philosopher Claudio Lopez Guerra, is what he calls the enfranchisement lottery, in which, by default, no one gets to vote. You keep having election, you keep having normal campaigns, but we don't know who the electors will be yet. Then immediately before the election, you randomly select about 20,000 people. They and only they are permitted to vote, but only if they first undergo some kind of competence building exercise where they're given certain kinds of materials and they have to deliberate with one another. There's a question about whether that can be done in an unbiased manner. You could have a system in which, so something that Brian Kaplan has toyed with, and I think is interesting as well, a system in which laws are passed through normal democratic legislatures, but certain bands of experts have the right to veto laws, if not to pass laws themselves. So imagine that you gave the Council of Economic Advisors veto power over certain legislation on the grounds that it was economically illiterate, in the same way that the Supreme Court can veto legislation on the grounds that it's unconstitutional, and then perhaps the Democratic legislature could override it with a sufficiently high supermajority vote. And finally, another system is what I call government by simulated oracle. This is a system in which everyone votes, but when you vote, you put down your demographic information, you take a quiz of basic political knowledge, and then you put down what you want, whether it's which candidate you want or what policies you prefer, something like that. And then with that data, you can then determine what would happen to the American public if they all got 100% on the quiz. What would they have preferred, while controlling for whatever effect their demographics has. And then you do that, what the enlightened public wants, rather than what the actual unenlightened public wants. So these are a variety of different forms of epistocracy. And in this book, I'm not here advocating them, saying that we should definitely do them. I think we don't yet know enough to know whether they would work better. A lot of what the book is meant to do is to convince you that democracy is not an end in itself. It's not inherently just. The kind of value it has is purely instrumental. It's simply a decision procedure for producing just outcomes, where the justice of the outcomes is defined independently of the procedure. And if we're able to find a better tool, a better decision procedure, one that works better, we should feel free to use it.
Is the Electoral College, at least in its origins, a form of epistocracy?
Right. So, I mean, there's a large amount of debate right now about what exactly it's meant to do. When you go back and read the early writings on it, some people are saying things like, well, what it's meant to do is make sure that some cities and states with large cities don't have all the power. Others are claiming that it's inherently racist, and the point was to sort of reinforce slavery. But nevertheless, at least some of the writers, some of the people who were advocating it, were saying things that sound epistocratic. The worry was, well, this is a one and final check on who the president will be, because if it's a really bad person, the people pick a really bad person, or whatever the process is to select the president ends up with a really bad person, this is one last check to replace that person with someone who might be better.
Although originally, the people weren't going to vote at all.
Yeah.
The people were perceived not to know who the greatest men in the original 13 states were, but they would know who the leading men, the smartest men in their colonies were, well, their states at that point. So they would elect leading men from their states who it was presumed would have a broader understanding of the whole country, and then those people would choose a president. And that seems like a form of graduated democracy that ideally was intended to end up with people who knew more,
right, making
the final decision.
Yeah, and it's never really worked out that way. We've always had a system basically in which people vote for a president. They're not literally voting for a president, of course. Legally speaking, they're not entitled. We could have state legislatures pick the electors if we wanted. But they're voting for what they perceive to be the president, and then electors just rubber stamp it. Once in a while, an elector will switch a vote to some other person, but there's never been any actual check there. So in principle, it's supposed to be a check on the populace. It's never actually worked out to be that way, and it probably never will.
In your book, you quote the famous suffragist and feminist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who sees the vote as affirming the full citizenship and dignity of women. And you say she's wrong to say that getting the vote would empower women. But if groups of people are excluded from the vote through a test or something like that, let's assume not by simply saying women don't vote or blacks don't vote, but through a test, aren't they being treated as second-class citizens? And won't they at least feel that they are?
Right. So this is a big question. I spend many chapters disentangling everything that goes in here. So one part of this question is, when you get a vote, does that make you more autonomous? And I think the answer is no. You personally are not made more autonomous. You don't move from being a mere petitioner to having real power simply by getting the vote yourself, because individual votes count for so little. Your chances of making a difference are so vanishingly small that it doesn't really matter whether you have one or not. If you vote or stay home won't make a difference. If you voted for the other side or vote for the side you prefer, it doesn't make a difference. So, and that's it's built into democracy. It's supposed to work that way. It's supposed to be a system in which groups matter, not individuals. The whole point is to disempower individuals. I think it's true that if you systematically exclude certain groups, you can expect negative things to happen. But one of the worries that people have, I call this the demographic objection to epistocracy. So one of the worries that people have is that suppose you had plural voting, or suppose you had a quiz of basic political information, and that's what determined whether you get the right to vote. We know that there will be systematic effects given background injustice in our society. So high information people are not evenly spread among all demographic groups. They tend to be higher income rather than lower income. They tend to be middle-aged rather than older or younger. They tend to be whiter rather than blacker. They tend to be maler rather than more female. And the effects can be compound, so that on average, if you look at, say, the Scott Keeter and Michael X. Delicarpini's 1996 book, What Americans Know About Politics and Why It Matters, a high-income, white, employed male at age 50 will score on a quiz of basic political knowledge roughly 3 times what, say, an unemployed 18-year-old uneducated black woman. Right? So we would expect that if there were this kind of system, you might get a populace that's not representative of everyone as a whole. Now, keep in mind, this only applies to certain forms of epistocracy, so Claudia Lopez Guerra's enfranchisement lottery completely avoids this problem. The system I talked about, the government by simulated oracle, this avoids that problem because you're testing for the effective demographics, so you're isolating that problem. So this would only apply to, say, Mill's plural voting or an enfranchisement by test kind of system. Even then, I'm not so sure it's as big of a problem as people think for a number of reasons.
So a lot of people say once you make that point, then it's unacceptable. We stop the discussion now.
Yeah. So if you think this is inherently unjust, I don't think you should be a Democrat at all. You shouldn't be in favor of democracy, period. You should actually be in favor of what's called sortition. So democracy, if you're like, well, this is unfair, it's like, great, you're not a Democrat anymore. Democracy is not fair. If you care about fairness, what you want are lotteries. So in a democracy, as a matter of fact, the voting public is not representative of the people as a whole. In voluntary voting systems, the people who vote are whiter, maler, more educated than the people as a whole. Even in compulsory voting systems like in Australia, that still holds because not everybody votes. Lots of people don't register and they get away with not voting. And in fact, you have a skewed electorate, not completely skewed, not as much skewed as it is here. Further, who wins office tends to be skewed towards higher income, high information people. The system, as we talked about before, tends to privilege the political preferences of some over others. It doesn't actually look at the median voter. It tends to be skewed towards higher income, more privileged voters. And then what you might call persistent minorities never get a say. So even in a democratic system, let's say you're a Native American, like the democracy can just ignore your preferences over and over and over again because you're not a big enough block. We can just ignore you. It doesn't matter what you say. Even our current election, you might argue that this was a system where whites got their say over minorities, despite having a democratic system. So if you actually cared about fairness, what you'd want to do is, say, flip a coin. What you might do is have everybody vote and then, say, apportion probabilities to candidates based upon what percentage of votes they get. But then rather than picking the person who gets the highest percent of votes, you then use a random number generator and use that to determine who wins based upon those probabilities. That would be a system in which it was genuinely fair and everyone had a chance. So democracy is also an unfair exclusionary system. So this point, by the way, it's not original to me. My former colleague David Estlin made this point. Fairness doesn't get you to democracy. Fairness gets you to sortition. So why is it people reject that system? Why don't they want that? It's because they think it won't work very well. They think it will lead to bad outcomes. And they're probably right. So once you say that, though, well, I care about not just fairness, I care about bad outcomes, then you're onto my side, and you have to start asking, okay, well, how are you going to weigh fairness versus the quality of the outcome? Right? So suppose it turned out epistocracy performed way better than democracy. Suppose it turned out that epistocracies had 3% more growth per year, and that growth got to the lower classes. Then over 100 years, it would turn out that epistocracies would be vastly richer than democracies. It would turn out, suppose epistocracies are significantly less pugilistic, so they fight fewer wars. Suppose it turns out that they actually have better attitudes towards, say, criminal justice reform, which is something I don't talk about in this book, but like I've been talking about this lately. When you go back in the 90s and you look at, say, what informed versus uninformed voters want, the informed voters were not in favor of having these incredibly punitive measures that we have in the U.S. It's likely that the over-criminalization that we have and over-incarceration problem we have in the U.S. would not have occurred if only we'd had a more informed electorate. So suppose epistocracy performs much better than democracy, but it's in some way unfair. Isn't that a reason maybe to say all things equal, it's better to have epistocracy than democracy?
Because ultimately, in a sense, this is a marketer's title for your book and not quite a precise title of what's in it. Because what your book is really should be titled is Against the Presumption That No System Could Be Better Than Democracy.
Yeah, that's right. So what I'm really attacking is what you might call democratic triumphalism. Maybe that's a pejorative term, but I have to give it some sort of phrase. So democratic triumphalism is the view that democracy deserves 3 cheers. Cheer number 1 is, it is just as an end in itself regardless of what it accomplishes. I don't think that's true. Cheer number 2 is that political power giving you political power makes you better off and enriches you and makes you a better person, and participating in politics tends to improve your character. I think that's empirically false. And then cheer number 3 is no system can work better than democracy. And that's the one where I'm like, well, I don't think we know that. I think there are systematic problems within democracies. Democracies create bad incentives that lead to misinformation and ignorance, and as a result we get lower quality government than we otherwise might. And it's worth thinking seriously about alternatives to democracy and start investigating them seriously. But we can't do that as a society until we get over this kind of view that democracy is inherently just, period, no matter what it does. So, I mean, aside from, I don't talk much about this in the book, but aside from epistocracy, there are other kinds of systems we might think about. So there are certain kinds of sortition-based systems that people like Alexander Guerrero at Rutgers and a few other, or Ben Saunders, I think he's at the University of Stirling, advocate, where they're supposed to randomly select people, but then in some way enrich them and make them more informed, and then ideally we get better politics through that. Robin Hanson at George Mason University advocates something called futurarchy, where people bet on beliefs and vote on values, and he advocates a kind of specialized betting market which can then be used to choose in turn various kinds of policies, and arguably this will lead to better outcomes than actually asking experts what they think. So you can read, there's a nice book called Predictocracy, I forget the author, that you can read that will talk about how betting markets work and why they tend to be more informative than any other kind of system. Ilya Somin, who's a law professor at George Mason, advocates, he's worried about political ignorance as well, and so in his book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, he says he wants a radically decentralized system in which you have lots of different kinds of polities with different policies, and it's made to be very easy to move from one place to another. It's easy to move, it's easy to change which government rules over you, and ideally in that system where there's foot voting rather than voting will lead to better politics.
Let me ask a question about you. By my count, and maybe this includes next year, you have published 8 books in 8 years. How do you do that?
Yeah, I try to write for 20 hours a week. That's pretty much the secret.
And then I guess I could say you have a job and children. How do you do that?
Well, I don't let other things. This is a good question. So I try to avoid letting the urgent take precedence over the important. If you're an academic, every day you walk in, you'll have lots of emails. As you become more famous, you get more and more emails. If you write an article saying that maybe Trump voters weren't very smart, you'll get 300 pieces of hate mail in a day. I found that out recently. So what you have to do is prioritize writing over other things. So I don't work an excessive amount. I work a 40-hour week, typical weeks. But I'm also in a situation in which I don't teach very many classes. I only teach 3 per year. I'm teaching classes I've already prepped before, so I know what to do for the class. I don't have to read a lot of new material necessarily or study more. I don't spend a lot of time on the small things, and I try to make sure that doesn't take most of my time. I just make sure that I spend roughly about 4 hours per working day writing up front. I write first, and I do everything else later. And if you do that, it's pretty easy to pump these kinds of things out. I mean, I think the other secret for me is just I always have a thing that I'm polishing, that I'm almost done with, a thing that I'm halfway through, a thing that I'm just beginning, and a thing that's churning in the back of my mind. And I can just kind of move those on a conveyor belt. And when I get stuck on one thing, like the thing I'm polishing, I need to take a while to think about it. Rather than coming in for a week and not doing much work, I move on to the thing that I'm about halfway through, and then my subconscious figures out what needs to happen over here, and I move back to that. So I think it's just an efficient, disciplined system of writing. That's it.
So should we expect 8 more books in the next 8 years?
Well, I hope so. I guess I'm on track for 2 more in the next 2 years, and maybe 3 more in the next 3 years. We'll see what happens from there.
All right. Well, that's very impressive. Having really written 1 book, I can't imagine A, having that many ideas, and B, finding the time to do them all. There's another new book by 2 political scientists that generated a Washington Post headline, "Washington's Government Elite Think Americans Are Morons." Is it good for political leaders to think that way?
Well, yes and no. I mean, how to put it? So this is such a hard question in many respects. In some respects, it's an easy question. In some respects, it's a hard question. So, you and I spend a lot of time thinking about how the people here work and what they do. And I think they have a strong incentive to behave often in selfish ways, in ways that are maybe destructive, in a way that I'm not so worried about, say, an epistocratic electorate would behave, just because the incentives are different. So to some degree, I think that can be dangerous because sometimes the people do have genuine wants and genuine problems, and they might ignore them and not listen when they should listen. On the other hand, I think that they know that the public doesn't know much about, say, the social sciences. They understand that, for example, the evidence for free trade is really, really strong, and the public doesn't like it because they don't understand it. So on a case-by-case basis, sometimes I think that's the way to think, sometimes I think not. Morons, though, morons is too strong of a word. People keep saying, are you saying the populace is stupid? And the answer is, no, they're not stupid. I think in their day-to-day lives, people are quite smart. They're perfectly capable of running their own lives in a smart way if you just give them the chance. So I'm not a paternalistic person. I don't want government running your life for you and my life for me, or even, a random stranger's life for them. I think people are good at running their own lives because the incentives are different. Like when I go to purchase a car, if I make a bad decision, I pay the consequences. If I make a good decision, I reap the rewards. Politics is entirely different. In democracy, what happens, like how you vote doesn't really matter, how I vote doesn't really matter, it's how we vote that matters. So one metaphor for that I like to use is imagine that we're having a class in which the professor has 210 million students, and she announces at the beginning of the class, 3 months from now we're going to take a final exam on basic political information, and you're not going to get your grade, I'm going to average all of your grades together and everyone will get the same grade. How much would you study? When I ask people that, they only say, I wouldn't study at all. Empirically, it turns out they don't study. So it's not that they're dumb, it's that they don't care. And the reason they don't care, the reason they don't think much about it is because their incentives are wrong.
Well, there's two reasons they don't care. Partly, they're just not that interested because, they could follow it. I know my vote isn't going to affect the election, but I'm interested. I follow it partly as a sports junkie and partly because I think it's important and it's my job. As you said, I have in my pocket a phone with all the knowledge in the history of the world. I'm assuming I could learn a great deal on my phone about thrash metal, but I have no interest in doing so, and I haven't done so. And you probably wouldn't want me running a music venue. So the question is, people who have very little interest in politics and policy and haven't taken the time, either because they're not interested or because, as you say, they know it's not really going to make any difference, should they be running the government or making the decisions about who will run the government? And that really is the question at the heart of your book.
Right. Yeah, and so I think then we can, and my worry about them is, we look at what they know, it's not very much, and we look at the policies that they advocate, and it seems like they wouldn't advocate what they do advocate if only they knew more. So I think the things that they press for, in general, they advocate them because they don't know what they're talking about. And you can just afford to indulge. And politics is different from our daily lives. In our daily lives, we can't afford to accept very many delusions because we'll be punished for them. If I'm crossing the street and I look and I see what appears to be a Mack truck barreling towards me at 50 miles an hour, I might have this fantasy, that's actually Optimus Prime, my childhood hero from the Transformers, coming to take me on an adventure, and we're going to beat Megatron together. But if I indulge that delusion, right, so I'm going to be punished by reality for allowing myself to believe that. When it comes to politics, I can afford to indulge any delusion. Like you and I actually agree a lot about policy, about what should happen. And if we're wrong about that, that has no negative effect on the world. It doesn't hurt us. Maybe it helps us to some degree, believing this. It doesn't cost us anything. And that's true of you and me, and that's true of everybody else as well. So the system is set up to allow people to be misinformed, to indulge their delusions, to make mistakes and not bear the consequences of it, because it's what we do that matters, not what any one of us does.
From a libertarian point of view, I'm thinking you argue that voters in democracy systematically make bad decisions, and you point out political decisions are imposed involuntarily through violence. Ultimately, when they say there's a $15 minimum wage, it means we will arrest you if you pay less than that. If they say we're going to war in Iraq, they will arrest you if you don't go, if you're a member of the military, if you don't pay your taxes. That seems to me an argument against having government make decisions rather than specifically an argument against democracy. Right. Because people make bad decisions through the political process, let's take as many decisions outside the political process as we can.
Right. And I think Ilya Somin in the book that I mentioned before, that's one of his theses. Now, this idea that government is involuntary, it's imposed through violence, it's non-consensual, if you believe what's called the consent theory of government authority, the consent theory is the view that government has authority over us only if we in some way consent to it, then you basically have to be an anarchist. I mean, David Hume, the philosopher David Hume, refuted the consent theory of government before the United States was even founded. Like, the philosophers have known for a long time, no version of that works. We could spend 20 minutes talking about all the variations of it. But most people, I think, accept, most people are statists, and even most philosophers are statists. And their attitude is something like, well, the consent theory of government fails, but that just shows that maybe government might be justified on some other kind of grounds. Maybe there's some other reason why we should have it. That said, I personally agree with you on this point, and agree with Elliot on this point, that I think governments are incompetent to make many kinds of decisions, and that's reasons for stripping them of that power. This book, though, I purposely avoided writing it as a libertarian-leaning book. It is, as I say in the beginning of the book, what I'm trying to convince you is if you are a Burkean conservative, I'm trying to convince you that you should be a Burkean conservative who takes epistocracy seriously. If you're a social democrat, I'm trying to convince you that you should consider a social epistocracy over social democracy. If you're a libertarian anarchist, then I'm trying to convince you that you should stay an anarchist, but if you had to choose between epistocracy and democracy, you should pick epistocracy over democracy. So I'm not trying to take a stance on any substantive policies that I myself advocate. I really want this to be, in a sense, ideologically neutral and just focused on the question of the best form of government, taking for granted what it happens to do.
One of my favorite movies is Animal House, and one of my favorite quotations in there is from Otter in The Trial, where he says, if the fraternity system is guilty, then isn't this an indictment of our entire American society, and we are not going to sit here and listen to you badmouth the United States of America. So when I read page 72 of your book, I wanted to know, do you hate America, or do you just hate fraternities?
That's right. Yeah, I have in the book too, I have this analogy to how democracies are kind of like college fraternities, and how philosophers, when they're defending from democracy, they're often defending an ideal form of democracy. Well, here's how democracy should work if only people were better, and then these good things would happen. And I say in the book something like, that's a little bit like saying, here's how fraternity should work if only they stuck to the ideals that are in their mission statements. And if they did that, then they would work really well. But as a matter of fact, they don't stick to the ideals, and they don't work that well. How to put it? Of course, I don't hate America. I mean, I dislike certain things that America has done. I think we have a sordid past with significant degrees of injustice. I think we'll have a sordid future with significant degrees of injustice as well. And there are all sorts of things that we're doing right now that are quite horrible. Comparing it to, say, other countries, I think there are some countries that do things better, a lot of countries that do things worse. I think there's a difference, though, between how we approach each other on the daily lives and what happens in politics. So the final chapter of this book I call Civic Enemies. At one point I considered calling the entire book Civic Enemies. The editor thought that was a bad idea. He was right. So what I say is, in our daily lives, we think about, say, market interactions. We're part of a vast web of cooperation. And people, when they talk about markets, they tend to think about the competitive aspect. I'm applying for a job and I'm competing against, say, 300 other people. And it seems like it's competitive, but as I think you and I agree, in fact, it's mostly a system of mass cooperation. If you take the pen that you're holding and you ask, how many people participated in building that pen? The answer is roughly around 50 million. It's millions and millions of people that participated in making that pen, only some of whom knew that they were doing that. So I think in our daily lives, we benefit from other people, we benefit from their expertise, we benefit from them getting their way. In general, our lives in society as a whole is a positive-sum interaction where other people's gains don't come at my expense but actually help me, and vice versa. But when you get to the sphere of politics, I think things change. So politics, one problem with that is just inherently, it just turns out because we're so biased, there's this tendency for us to think, well, if I disagree with you, then you're my enemy and I don't like you. And I don't want to be your friend. But if I agree with you, if you have the same politics, I'm more likely to be your friend. And that already, the psychology of that, which I explore at great length in the book, is pretty disturbing. But I think it's even worse than that. It's not just that we're biased. Rather, politics, what it does is it takes the sphere of possibility and it narrows it down to only a few things. And it makes us what I call situational enemies, where we're basically forced to be against each other. So imagine that, like, my analogy would be, you and I are taken by some Romans and put in a gladiatorial contest. Like, it's not that I inherently hate you, it's not that I have any reason to oppose you inherently, but now that we're put in the gladiator pit and given some weapons, and the answer, either you kill me or I kill you, then I'm forced to fight you and you're forced to fight me, and we become enemies as a result. So I think that's part of what happens in politics. By narrowing it down to, we are going to impose this monopolistic, unilateral decision upon everybody, and they have to just live with it, then we become enemies of one another. And finally, there's one other reason to dislike others when they when they're voting and their way they participate in politics, and that's because they don't do it competently. So imagine like you're being tried for, say, a capital murder trial, like first-degree murder, and let's say the jury doesn't pay any attention to the facts of the case, but just finds you guilty because they flipped a coin. Or suppose they don't pay any attention to the facts of the case, and they find you guilty because they don't like you. They think you're they just don't like you personally. Or suppose they find you guilty because they were paid off to find you guilty. Or suppose they find you guilty because they foolishly believe that you're one of the reptilians from underground, the lizard people that's trying to take over the world, and this is the way of getting back at you. In each of those cases, I think you'd have real reason to despise the jury and hold them in with contempt for what they've done to you. They are exercising massive amounts of power over your life and the potential to deprive you of life, liberty, property, and happiness at gunpoint, literally. And they're doing it incompetently and without good faith. You have reason to despise them. If we were ruled by a king and that king made his decisions capriciously with misinformation, we'd have reason to despise the king for exercising so much power over us in such a capricious, careless way. So I think in the same way, we have reasons to look at the electorate as a whole and go, why are you doing this to me? Like you're given a significant amount of power and you're exercising it in a capricious, careless way. You're not acting competently. You're not acting in good faith. And we have some reason to be angry at one another for that. But it's politics' fault. It's not that people are bad. I'm not a romantic about, as the great Jim Buchanan said, the great economist Jim Buchanan said about like politics, don't be romantic about it. It's not a struggle of good versus evil. It's about the incentives. And I think democracy creates bad incentives.
One of the criticisms of democracy that I think has been common, particularly in conservative literature, is based on, there's a quote that it's not clear anybody ever actually said, democracy can only exist until the majority discovers it can vote itself largesse out of the public treasury. But you don't think that's actually an accurate criticism of democracy?
Right. So I think early on when people like Hamilton and Madison and sort of American founders were writing about this, they had a view of democracy as largely being self-interested voting, and what will happen in democracy is that we'll bargain with one another. I mean, they wouldn't even call it democracy. They would say constitutional republic. Philosophers don't think that's an interesting distinction, perhaps, but in a Republican form of government, we're all going to be voting for our self-interest, but ideally we'll reach compromise and we'll have a kind of enlightened form of self-interest. It was a pretty reasonable hypothesis, but to my surprise, when I first started studying this, there's a huge empirical literature testing the claim, are voters voting selfishly? And they keep finding the answer is no. And one of the reasons why there's such a large literature is because every time someone got the answer no, they thought, that can't be right, let's test it again a different way. And then they come up with a new sort of test and they get the answer no again. And then like, that can't be right. And the next thing you know, there's 50 papers showing the same thing. Voters don't vote selfishly. They vote, so the better way of putting it is that they are what we call nationalist sociotropes, meaning they vote for what they perceive to be the national interest. That doesn't mean they vote for what's in fact the national interest. They might not know what they're talking about, but they vote for what they perceive to be altruistic concerns. They vote expressively. For most people, voting is more like doing the wave at a sports game. It's like waving a flag for your sense of justice and what you think matters, rather than voting your self-interest. And it's puzzling that they would be like that, given that people are very selfish in their day-to-day lives, until you think about the incentives. If you're a selfish person, it doesn't make sense for you to vote in the first place. So say Donald Trump called me up on November 7th and said, tomorrow I want you to vote for me, and if I win, I will give you $10 million. He's not saying I'll pay you $10 million for you to vote for me. He's just saying if I win, I'll give you $10 million. Now I have a $10 million stake in Trump winning, but it doesn't mean it's worth my while to actually vote for him. The chances of my vote making a difference are so small, the chances of me even getting into a car accident on the way over to the polls are fairly high, that the selfish thing to do would be to stay home and play video games, or to go write a paper, or do something else, or watch TV. So if people are going to vote, they tend to vote expressively to express their commitment to what's good and right. Selfish voting just doesn't make sense. It doesn't pay for itself.
One of my other favorite documents, which is sort of the mission statement of the United States, says, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Mm-hmm. Does our system rest on the consent of the governed?
No, I don't think so. I think the metaphor of a contract is just really completely misleading. So in the book I have a whole section on this, and I think about like a typical consensual transaction. Like an example I like to use is I call up Sweetwater and I ask them to send me a Telecaster type of guitar. Using country music, not in thrash metal, because I recently got into that too. So I call them up and I say, I want a guitar, I'm going to give you some money. They send it to me. That's a typical consensual transaction. Now think about how government works. Imagine that instead of they just send me the guitar and they say, here you go, like we're giving this to you, and then they demand money. I can just say, well, I didn't actually ask for it. I have to perform some sort of action that signifies my consent. If they ask if I want a guitar and I say, no, I don't want one, that ends the deal. It won't take place. Or if I send them my money and then they don't send me the guitar, that wasn't a consensual transaction. That would be fraud or something else. So then you think about your relationship to government. Does it look like buying a Telecaster? Well, not really. Regardless of what you say, they do what they're going to do. There's no actual act that you do that signifies your consent. You don't say, I do. You don't sign a contract. You don't... If you actively dissent, it doesn't make a difference. You can't say no. So if you get pulled over for, say, possessing marijuana, you can't say, oh, no, you don't understand. I don't consent to that law. I dissent from it. They don't let you go. They say, we don't care. Further, there have been a number of Supreme Court cases where they test the question, well, what if you do your part and government doesn't do its? So there was a case here in D.C. where a woman called the police and said, like, there's people breaking into my apartment, come help me. And they didn't. And they hurt her and they raped her. And then she sued. And then went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, the government doesn't owe you protection, it just owes protection to people in general. So this is not like a consensual transaction which you do your part and you get something in return. Rather, you pay your taxes and they don't owe you anything in return. That's the official government ruling. So finally people might say, well, maybe it's like tacit consent because by choosing to remain here, you consent to living in that government. That might be true of someone like me. Like I've had the option to move to other countries, so I've had the real live option of living in one place rather than another. So maybe you can make an argument that someone like me who's specially entitled is consenting to the U.S. government. But most of us don't actually have the right to go move somewhere else. We're not legally allowed to do so. Our government will let us go, but the other governments won't let us come in. So we're stuck where we are. So the fact that we remain doesn't necessarily show that we're consenting. And David Hume's metaphor for this back in the 1700s was, imagine you've been kidnapped and you wake up in the middle of a ship and the captain says, you know, you can either put up with my rule, or if you don't like it, you can leave. And leaving means jumping overboard and dying. Well, that's effectively the deal most of us have. I mean, you don't like the U.S. government's rule, go live in the ocean. You can't really do that. I mean, you can't even move to Antarctica. Legally speaking, they won't let you. So it's like all of the land has been taken up by other governments, and most of them will not let you live there if you want to. So you don't tacitly consent by remaining in the U.S. You don't have any meaningful choice.
All right, as we wrap this up, it seems like we're pretty unlikely to actually replace democracy with epistocracy. So if that's the case, what's the main value readers should get from your book?
So one is we could change our civic culture. Right now we have this thing where we try to push everybody to vote no matter what. And that's, I think, a dangerous way of thinking. We should be pushing for, I think, a culture in which we say informed voting. If you're an informed voter, then you're doing us a favor. And if you're an uninformed voter, you're not. And we should be pushing for that instead. The other thing we can think about is, are there alternatives that are legal, that are constitutional, that might work better? So Brian Kaplan talks about things like, well, what if we pay people, you get, right before the election takes place, you can come take this quiz, and if you do well on it, the voter achievement exam will give you a tax credit or some kind of payment. We could incentivize people to know a little bit more. These are things that are legal. But fundamentally, what I'm trying to get people to do is think, democracy is not magic, it is not sacred, it does not have the value that a person has, it does not have the value of a beautiful poem. It is merely a hammer. That's all it is. It is a tool for producing outcomes, and we should be in favor of looking for ways to improve that tool or replace it if we can.
All right. Thank you, Jason Brennan, for an interesting book and an interesting conversation.
Thank you very much.